There we go. Welcome. Glad you are here. And we're going to jump right into how your brain likes to study. So, studying may be something that you've been told to do throughout your whole life. I know it was for me. And I'm not going to lie, before I knew this work, I used to pretend to study where I would sort of move my eyes on the page, but I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. I feel like everybody else knew how to do it and I didn't. And people would get their highlighters and highlight. And so I'd choose a few sentences and color them, but it certainly wasn't functional. It certainly wasn't helpful. And you deserve better than that. I'm sorry, my camera keeps wonking out for those of you who are live with me right now. Hang in there. I think it's going to be a very Kesty kind of tech night. Not going to lie. That happens to me. Okay. For those of you who are live with me, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to ask a small favor that don't let me be such a dork this time. If I think I'm sharing my screen and I'm talking about a screen that you don't have context for, do a little in the chat because last time, unfortunately, gosh, I showed my screen was still on the slides when I was trying to show a website resource and it was just goofy. So human moment, and also I'm learning and trying to up level constantly. So I appreciate the feedback and the help. Thank you all. Oops, that was a small crash in my house. Let's go from the beginning. Okay. This is me. You know me. I'm Sarah Kesty. I'm an executive function coach, an advocate, and just someone who truly believes in making a difference for differently wired humans like myself, like most of the people I love in life. I was lucky enough to be Teacher of the Year throughout different settings 4 times and definitely took advantage of the platform to speak up for all of us. So that's me. I have the Executive Function podcast and the IEP OMG show. And both of those, again, are aimed to support my mission to make this world a better place for incredible humans who have differently wired brains. That's me. And I wrote a book called Everyone Has Something. Okay. Clearly, it's not really within my big skill set to be self-promoting. So we're jumping into that webinar. That's why you're here. Just as with all of our times together, and if you're listening, this is a little bit different because it's only on audio. So if you're listening to like the podcast version of this audio visual experience, you're going to have to rely on your brain to visualize things. But either way, anytime you're learning something extra outside of a classroom is an awesome time to think of it like a strategy playground. And what I mean is this is very low stakes, high interest, hopefully, and something that you can learn and practice your strategies in. So we're going to think about, okay, this is something that could go a little long and you could end up feeling like, oof, I'm a little bit tired. So how do you maintain your focus during this time? And you can practice self-regulating where you're thinking about, okay, does my body need more or less energy? You can practice movement. Am I someone who does well when I'm able to move a little bit?
Gosh, tons of other things. If it feels a little bit boring for you, you could practice finding something interesting to think or to listen for or to take notes so that you're activating more of your process. Whatever you would like to do, but the idea is you're trying something and watching your brain as you learn. Okay. Automatically records any. Ooh, thank you for that, Roberta. That's awesome. Okay, I'll have to check that out. Roberta just shared in the chat a couple of resources and takes notes with AI. You know what? That only went to the hosts and panelists. So I'm going to empower everybody to share all together. And then I just added that to everyone. That's Roberta's resource. Thank you. We are so much stronger together. And I really appreciate you jumping in, which is awesome. And Roberta and Wendy and all those of you who have jumped in and participated are modeling exactly what goes with our brand here with Brain Tools Coaching. And that is jump in, ask if something doesn't make sense, interrupt if you need to. Really, that's part of the strategy playground of, okay, am I comfortable speaking up when I need clarity? And this is a super safe place to do it because I will never, ever shame you for asking a question. Even if I've said it 100 times, if the 101st time lands in your brain, awesome, you got it. Never any shame. So another opportunity to treat it like a strategy playground and think about, how can I practice self-advocating in this situation where I know no points are going to be taken away from my grade, no one will be upset with me, and Sarah's super safe. Food for thought. Okay, talking about making the most of our time, you might want to write some stuff down. And writing down could mean on a notebook, it could mean on a sticky note, it could be something in your phone. You could text it to someone and say, hey, remind me of this. But just have a way to capture your ideas. And then a calendar, because we always end with our plan and our promise of, okay, what's next? Because I do not want to be another person in your ear telling you what to do without really breaking it down into things that actually will happen. Because there's a big difference, and that's what I do a lot in my coaching and my trainings, is how do we get from knowing and kind of having that like cerebral experience to doing and having the strategies actually help real life. That's what it's all about. It's about working with your neurology and finding strategies to smooth out life. So some sort of time management system, calendar, digital or paper, will come in handy at the very end. If you are watching this recorded or you're here live, do your very best to stay through the whole thing so that you have it come full circle, you get the closed feedback loop, and you have that accountability at the very end of, okay, now I can see myself taking just one small step. That's going to pave your bridge between knowing and doing. And then the very last thing, super on track with what we're talking about tonight, and that is just a reminder about your brain janitors. So your body has a system, obviously, like the system that makes potty takes out I know I'm a grown-up that says potty, but so be it, it's me. That system takes out the things that you don't need and gets rid of them. You have a similar system that runs through your brain, and it's especially active at night. So the cool thing is, if you get good sleep and enough sleep, it clears out your brain and you can think pretty well the next day. The bummer is your brain janitors aren't really tuning into school stuff that you need to keep. And so sometimes they'll just like clear the brain room, and it's actually stuff that you want to remember. So one way to work with your brain at night is to tell your brain, yo, this is important. Brain janitors, don't throw this away. And how you do that is to review closer to bedtime, not something that will make you super anxious, but maybe the flashcards that are almost there in your brain, reviewing those right before bedtime. You can practice it with this too. And I know this is already evening time for all of us. So unless you're from far, far away, if you're in the US, it's evening time. So this may serve as your evening review. But if you're not, if you're watching this, make sure you set a little reminder for 8-ish, 9-ish to say, okay, what were my main takeaways today? Just 5 or 10 minutes, and that will help your brain janitors know this matters. Don't throw it away. And again, you guys have already done a great job speaking up, but if there is something that you're wondering or something that doesn't make sense, I don't want to move on just for the sake of moving on. Let me know and we can address it in the moment. Okay. There we go. All right, our plan tonight. This is going to feel weird because we don't get into the actual studying techniques until the fourth thing. And that's because there is so much work to do before the studying happens. And wait, let me rephrase. Not work. There are so many cool strategies and brain hacks to do before you actually sit down and crack the book or whatever strategy you pick, so that it's way more effective and doesn't waste your time. Not work, strategies. There we go. So we're going to talk about kind of a throwback to October's webinar. And if you haven't seen that yet, I'll show you where to find all of these resources, or the YouTube channel has them as well. But we're looking at our grade autopsies, looking back to what did we learn from old tests and kind of unlocking how our teachers play the school game. And then how can we take that to make a plan? We're then going to talk about some really good ways to prepare yourself for studying, including defining what studying even includes, right? Like if I had to say what is studying, I imagine people would be like, I don't know, studying. Like you define it with itself, or maybe you're like, oh, you're just rereading. And spoiler alert, that's no, we're ditching that. That's very archaic. It doesn't work for your brain. So what is studying? And in particular, for one particular class or final that you have coming up, what would studying entail? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the red, yellow, green approach, and then some active studying. So you'll notice there's a whole bunch of lead up by design, because we really have a lot that we can tap into and a lot we can eliminate as problems before we get into the studying proper. And aren't my students so cute? That's an old picture. They're pretty old now. Okay, so sorry to inform you, but you are not psychic. You can't always tell what's on a test. So generally, the first few tests in a semester are kind of rocky, right? Like you're like, I think I got it, but I don't know. But at this point in the semester, so we're recording in December, you've got a pretty good idea of what the tests look like. And that is awesome news, because even if you haven't done so hot in the past, you're not doing double learning. The first couple tests, you're learning the content and what the test is like. You're learning how to student and the actual content. But now you can kind of travel back in time in your brain and say, okay, what was that like? What does my teacher value? What is most of the test? And then you can form your study plan based on that. So for example, if most of your information on the test in, let's say, science or history is just like repeat it back, just mostly memory or multiple choice. Ooh, if it's mostly memory based, we're going to really focus on memorizing for your study plan. Maybe not rereading for whole big concepts, because maybe you just need to capture a whole bunch of small ideas and hang on to them as details. But let's say your teacher has mostly essays or short answers. That's a different study technique. That's zooming out and kind of appreciating the big picture. That maybe your studying is less rereading. I'm a big fan of dropping the rereading if you haven't figured that out yet. Maybe it's mapping it. Maybe it's making a concept map, an understanding, so that you're ready to explain a big concept on the test. Or if it's essays or more writing based, maybe it's memorizing a couple of really good sentence starters to help you get unstuck. Like if it's talking about in English or maybe literature class, and they're asking you about an author's style or writing, you could memorize in the piece blank, author asserts blank, and that just kind of gets you going because you know you've got it started. It's like how if I went dun, 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 you could finish it. Same idea. You're setting up your brain, by the way, dun dun, in case anybody was stuck. But you're setting up your brain to kind of fill in the blanks for you, and having that bit of sentence frame or that readiness in your brain helps turn down the stress volume and helps just get you going. And there's a whole bunch of research that says once you're going, your brain's way more likely to get on board with writing, with any habit. What are you wondering about the old tests helping you make a study plan? Keep in mind that you're absolutely welcome to interrupt at any time if something isn't clear, but for time, I'm going to move. Okay. So let's say you've identified, all right, my test comes from mostly this. And so most of my study time I'm going to spend with this type of strategy. Now the next step would be to prepare yourself. And here's what I mean. Oftentimes we're so overwhelmed by, I have to study, I have to study, I have to study, that finally, when we convince our little toddler brain and we pull it by the hand and we sit it down at the table and we say, we're studying, then you realize you have no idea. Like, what is studying? Do I look at the book? Do I stare it down? I remember my 6th grade teacher had a poster with and I didn't know what osmosis meant at the time, but it was Garfield with a book on his head as a hat. And it said, I'm learning by osmosis. And now I know osmosis would have been not literally, but like transferring the knowledge from the book into his brain. But it's funny to me now to think that that's kind of what I was expecting of myself when I would sit down and sort of like color the pages with my highlighter, but not really like aimlessly wander through text. And then I was done when I got too tired that I couldn't see anymore. That was my studying. But after a few tries of like, oh, I don't have to reread everything, or, oh, I can come in here knowing what the test demands of me and base my approach on that, it got faster, it got more efficient, and it was definitely more effective. So here we are. We know generally the approach. The next step would be to schedule studying with a start and an end. So your brain gets to know, okay, I'm going to be done at X time. It can't linger into the wee hours of the morning because it's not effective. And your brain's going to fight you less if it knows that the torture is over at a certain time. And by the way, after a few trials of these strategies, it won't feel so torturous. So there's hope. Next thing, and we're going to work on this strategy together, but the next thing would be to list out the actual content of what you want to put in your brain. So instead of, I need to study history, and you've got what, from August to now to shove in your head, maybe you say, okay, my teacher said he's going to emphasize the Civil War, and I need to know these particular dates and these particular big moments and why they mattered in context. That's a list that your brain can handle. So we're going to work a little bit more on fine-tuning that list. But for now, as you're preparing your study sessions, maybe even this weekend for finals, think about how you can gather the list of materials. And that also means excluding a few things. I'm not going to study that because even though we read it and we talked about it for fun, my teacher said, or my professor said, it's not going to be on the test. So be it. It can park over there. And then the last thing is to prepare your study space for deep focus. And these webinars are for parents and students. So I want to just put it out there that deep focus unrolls in many, many ways. Some people do need a little bit of noise, like maybe classical music or white noise or some sort of auditory input so that their brain isn't seeking different things. So some people have systems where they're auditory system, their ears are sort of like, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And you can calm that curious nature by having sort of a constant sound. So don't think that it has to just be like total silence to get deep focus. If your kid's advocating, there we go, and saying like, hey, I do need my earbuds, there's a chance that that's very valid. So we can experiment with that. But I will make the argument, and research has shown that having your phone in the room with an eye shot will steal a good chunk of your brain. So this is where it gets tricky. You're going to have to commit to, if you wanted like a certain sound in your ears, you're going to have to commit to a pretty good long soundtrack and then put your phone outside of the room. And I know that really stinks because hello, it's your phone. It's part of you. But again, we're thinking about 30 powerful minutes to really improve your grade and have a better test experience versus 90 very bumpy minutes where you're fighting with yourself because your phone's way more fun than anything you can do studying. I think I'll take the 30 so I have 60 minutes of actual fun. And I know it's a tough sell right now, but you can just blame me if you need to. But phones go out of the room for deep focus while you're studying. Another thing also to consider is your physical needs. So right now I'm at my standing desk. Maybe you need to find a way to move while you study. Studying and deep focus don't have to look the same for everybody. I know some people who pace while they study and that helps them. Like they move their bodies, they get their blood flowing. Great. I know some people who hunch over and I swear like become a wax museum figure for a couple hours because that's what helps them focus. It's going to be different for everybody, but the idea is you plan ahead for what you know works for you and be pretty stubborn about it. I can tell you what doesn't work, again, is your phone. Many interruptions. So it may mean closing your door, putting a little sticky note on it, or telling your roommate like, hey, I'm going to be studying. You can't hang out with me. You can't have people over, or even like moving yourself to a quiet space, like maybe the library, something like that. And again, I hope you noticed that this was a big spectrum of options because every brain is different. But what we share in common is the need to plan and prepare for deep focus. Okay. Studying is boring. Spoiler alert, it can be super boring and super nebulous, which we're going to talk about in a sec. So it's hard to convince your brain to do something that's not super exciting, can be very stressful, and you don't really even know what the thing is anyway. So holy cow. That's like if you made the perfect recipe for procrastination, there it is. Boring, difficult, and confusing, right? So we're addressing all of those pieces. And right now is the boring part. So we know that we can kind of trick our toddler brains. And I'm not talking literal toddler. I mean, sometimes our brains are so focused on basic needs and self-regulation that they feel a little bit like a 3-year-old. So we can trick our brains into giving us more of the chemicals that we want, reducing more of the chemicals that we don't, or even like tapping into some of the stress chemicals like cortisol when we need them. We'll talk about that. But there are a couple of things that definitely work. So one thing is to make it special. So if you are studying for finals and you're dreading it, or you feel like it's really boring, maybe you make it special in your household. And parents, this is where you can kick in. Maybe the week of finals is like really yummy food, or it's a no TV until X time because we're just setting the stage and we're making it really fun where your kid gets their favorite snack or their favorite Starbucks drink or whatever it is to sort of turn down the stress and turn up the special, turn up that anticipatory feeling that dopamine, like, ooh, yay, finals week is kind of a little bit fun. I know kids, you're like, Sarah, no way, but it does work. And your parents can surprise you with little things, and that will still manipulate your brain into feeling like, oh, when I do this, sometimes good things happen. Another thing is to try body doubling. So, and I know if you watch November's webinar, you're like, duh, we know this, but it's always nice to have it a few different ways. But body doubling is where you borrow somebody else's energy, and they don't have to be studying the same thing you are. They don't even have to be studying. It could be you sit down next to someone who can also deep focus next to you, and you both just jam on your independent work. But the idea is, because our brains are socially wired to match people around us, because we're sort of monitoring the social expectations of the environment, and our brains are helping us match that. That's part of what our brains evolved to do to stay alive, because we had to be accepted in our tribal state. If we got isolated, we didn't live to pass on our genes. So our brains are pretty wired to be socially impacted. Take advantage of it. Sit by someone who can really get into the zone, someone that's fun, but not too talkative, but that can partner up and kind of help you regulate your energy just based on being near them. Here's where we can up our cortisol in a good way. You can compete with yourself, with a timer, with a previous score on a Quizlet. But the idea is, when something's boring, adding a little bit of urgency or competition can help take a little bit of the boredom out, because now it's like, oh, cool. I'm going to see if I can beat my last score, or I'm going to see how quickly I can get through this, or I'm going to see how many of the sentence starters I can get memorized tonight. Something like that. And then the last idea is to make sure you are treating your brain with love, with compassion, and rewarding it. So our brains are a little bit goofy about mental energy. They really want to hold in what we spend, because what if there's a big threat and we need mental energy? So it takes a little bit, and especially if you have a brain with ADHD or autism, or just a different wiring, it takes a little bit of coaxing to get your brain to do something like this. But you can reward your brain and start shaping your brain's future behavior. So it's pretty close to these positive associations where you make studying special. But the idea is, you're doing things on purpose to show your brain that you're safe when you study, and that it feels good. You have small wins. And sometimes that means just high five me, I got it. And sometimes that means like, all right, I earned it. I'm going to go have a chocolate or whatever it is that's rewarding to you. And parents who are here, that's also when you get to start spoiling your kids a little bit and say, look at you, superstar. Here's a starburst while you study. Okay. Those of you listening on the podcast, I am projecting a picture of Jell-O. I mean, not Jell-O, pudding. And here's the deal. I know my desserts, people. All right. Here's the deal. Studying can feel like trying to hold a gallon of pudding. Like, okay, you can probably hold like maybe a cup and a half between your two hands. But if you're physically trying to hold a gallon of pudding, that is a really hard / impossible job. But if you can put parameters on it, if you can make a bowl or a bucket or some sort of container where you know where the pudding goes, you will be able to understand what it entails. You will be able to hold the pudding. When we study, oftentimes we do not go in there with a bowl for our studying. We don't go in there with parameters. And so it feels like, okay, I'm going to grab this. Oh, shoot, I dropped it. I'm going to grab that. Okay, but I can only ever hold 2 cups. Our next step in studying. So we've thought about setting ourselves up, figuring out what content we need. Now we're going to add just a few more sides to the parameters so that we have a good functional bucket, so to speak, for our studying. So you're going to define enough. What will you know, feel, be able to do when you have studied enough? Because again, oftentimes we're told, hey, study, or even study harder. But like, how do you do something harder if you don't even know what the thing is? So here's what helps you sort of put parameters on it so it's not so overwhelming. You know when you reach the metric that you were aiming for, and you can finally feel done. Because I think that's what is extra dreadful about studying is, when are you ever done? Like, short of memorizing a textbook or writing a master's thesis on something, like, do you ever fully know everything about a topic? No. I've been in love with executive function for almost 20 years. Do I know everything about it? Well, of course. No, just kidding. No, of course not. But I know when I'm aiming for something, when I've done enough, because I think about the end. What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to prepare for you guys tonight? What do I want to explain? And then that I have to make peace with is enough. And with studying, I think we get in our own heads and think, what if, what if, what if? And then, of course, it never feels like enough. So my challenge for you, before you even crack a book or write a flashcard, is to think about, what will mastery look like? What will I be able to do? What will I be able to know? And what am I willing to be a little bit fuzzy on and still feel okay? And you are empowered to make these decisions, even though you're like, I'm not psychic, you just told me. You are empowered to make these decisions because you have already taken a few tests this semester with your teacher, and you know kind of their jam. You know the flavor of their tests. You know mostly how they present content and what might be asked of you. So based on that, you can define what enough looks like, sounds like, and empowers you to do. I know it's scary, and this might be something that you want to partner up with a parent or a coach or a teacher or somebody with, just to kind of help have a second set of eyes and brains on it. Totally fine. And I added the meme, the do your best little kitten hanging on a branch, because we say do your best intending to be helpful to ourselves, to our students, to our kids. But really, when we say do your best is a big gallon of pudding too. What is your best? And your best on one day might be different on another day, because our best is inconsistent. So as you're kind of coaching yourself through your study sessions, remind yourself that you get to pick what your best is, and you can start by defining it and then make a plan backwards to what you're going to do to get there. And let's be real, your best isn't like doctorate level work. Hello? No. I mean, unless you're in a doctorate program, then maybe it is. But our best is never going to be perfection, right? Like, our best is going to be what we decide gets the job done in the way that we want it done. And then the rest can just go. I know that that is way easier said than done, but allow yourself to take a little bit of faith and say, okay, maybe I'll try it. Because beating yourself up or not quitting until your eyes literally close because you fall asleep, those haven't worked so hot. Maybe we try this. Okay. So we talked about make a plan, list out what you need to study, set yourself up for success, eliminate the things that will break your deep focus, decide what knowing your topic will look like and feel like and empower you to do. Now we're cracking into the study skills. Isn't that wild? We took so long to get here, but here we go. And this is a little bit of like a gray area. It's a little bit prep, a little bit study. Sometimes I've worked with students who bring their flashcards that are like, I don't know, 100 or 200 cards deep, and they're just jamming on them. And then you ask, well, how many of those do you know right away? Like you watch them and they're just so fast. And they're like, oh, probably like 100 of them. Loves, studying does not mean going over everything. Studying is kind of like a touch-up job. Like if you've ever seen somebody paint something or do like frosting on a cake. You do the big frosting and then you sort of touch up with the details. The big frosting of your learning cake has been all semester. Studying is the details. So don't waste your precious study time on things that you already know pretty automatically. So here's what we do. We take the big list, the study guide that our teachers gave us, or the information that we gleaned from the old tests. And then we think, okay, what's automatic? And the things that are automatic, and this list will grow as you study, but the things that are automatic, you stop studying. They're in your brain already. They don't need maintenance. We're good. You can revisit them maybe once before the test, but those come off of your list. They don't need to take your time. Then we separate it into those were the green light categories, the automatic. Then we move over to the yellow light categories of things like, I got to slow down and give this a little bit more time. These are things that you're almost 100% on, but oh, there's just this one part that like, nope, it's not solid yet. Those are things that you review using the materials you have and just sort of solid up in your brain. So if you're frosting a cake, this would be the part where like, whoops, I got a little bit of that cake crumb, the crumble in the frosting. I'm going to pull that out and kind of patch up that spot. That's what that is. Not a whole lot of effort. You do it with the frosting you already have. You do it with the school materials you already have. This would take about a third of your study time. And the cool thing is, as you get really solid on these skills that are like almost automatic, they go in the automatic pile and then you stop studying them. And so you're watching as you start with this big, I got to cram this into my brain list, and you're monitoring and slowly taking things off of the heavy duty study list until there's really only a few things. And the heavy duty study list is the stuff that you know is shaky in your brain. Sorry. These are the things that you don't know, or you might say the wrong word, or you can't finish a sentence. Those things that are solidly not known yet get the most attention. Those are our red light items. They're the things that we use our materials that we have now. And we may seek extra help in the form of tutors, in the form of Khan Academy or Quizlet, things outside of the regular school stuff. And by the way, even though none of your friends at school will admit it, everybody's doing this. So if you watch your brain, when I said use some extra stuff, if your brain just said, yeah, because I'm dumb, or, like kind of had some talk back, you can tell your brain very politely that it's full of it. Because even though it's not cool to talk about how hard people work so hard. And a lot of your friends, the ones that you even look over at school and you're like, why is this so easy for you? It looks easy because they're using these strategies. They're using Quizlet. They're watching Khan Academy. They're looking things up on YouTube when something doesn't make sense. They may not outright say that they're studying hard, but they sure are. And you can too. And that's really what it comes down to, is just playing the school game smartly with some good strategies. So as we start thinking about the big list that we had, we prepared our space, we kind of got ourselves psyched up with some things that'll make us feel better. We've talked to ourselves about, okay, what is enough? Now we're formatting our list, our plan, into things that we don't need to study anymore, need a little bit of attention, and need a lot of attention. And remember, there's no shame in that lot of attention, because maybe you were absent, or maybe it just didn't jump in your brain the first time. Ain't no thing, but now's the time to put it in your brain. Okay, so how do we put it in your brain? Active studying. I'm going to take a tiny sip and pause here, because I know I get so excited that I just groove through this. What are you wondering right now? All right, we'll jump back in. Oh, yay. It's like I'm waiting for trick-or-treaters. I see somebody in the chat. Super anxious, not knowing when is enough is enough. How do you help them focus, narrow their focus? Focus their narrow. Sarah Kesty can read, can't she? How do we narrow our focus in terms of what to study, or in terms of what's good enough? Kind of both, huh? You look at old tests and you really dissect them. And if you've seen the October webinar, and maybe you haven't, I can send it to you. But the idea is, you think about, okay, what does my teacher value? What shows up on every test? What doesn't show up on the tests? And kind of how can I play the game around the content that's coming up? And sometimes it is a leap of faith that enough will be enough. And that part's tricky. And that sometimes takes a couple times where you're like, okay, I'm going to let myself prove to myself that this is worth the risk. And I'm with you. Wendy thinks in the concern in that it doesn't feel like a strategy playground at school, because you have, yeah, you can try different strategies when you're a student, but you get points taken away if the strategy doesn't work as planned. And that stinks. Like, where else does that happen in the world? Like tonight, if I had nobody show up to the webinar, like, okay, maybe I didn't try the right strategy. Maybe I need to focus on letting people know more often, or set more reminders. But like, I get to play with those without someone directly impacting my future with my grades. And I think your concern and what you're sharing that your child goes through is, holy cow, we're saying we value innovation and all these things as a society, but then we're still penalizing kids for like trying new things and having a couple bumps in the road, because that's life. So I think acknowledging that it's kind of a sticky situation, but then also empowering your kid with the chance to practice, and just acknowledging that it is really tricky, is going to be super helpful. But that's definitely a deeper conversation that you and I can geek out on too. And I hope that helps. Okay, so we are on to active studying. Here's the deal, my loves. I've said it like 100 times because I very much mean it. Rereading, blindly rereading, or not blindly, but opening your book without a purpose and just hoping that if you start on the first word and end on the last word, that is studying, ditch that. And you might have even been told to do that by a teacher, right? Like, read the book, it's in the book. But I hate to tell you, teachers don't even do that. We might read the book, but we read sections and we read with purpose. And so my offering to you tonight is to think the book is a tool, but it's not your study plan. You can definitely look back if you need to find a reference or you're wondering something, or there's something really heavily emphasized that you want to more deeply understand. If it's on your list of read things that you don't totally know, for sure. Yeah, reread, but don't start first word, go to the end and think that that's studying. It won't help you. Your brain's going to peace out after about 3 sentences because there's no threat, there's no reward, your brain's done. So we're ditching that. Another idea, an idea that actually works, is to set up a system so that you're a little bit wrong. And I know that seems silly, right? You're like, what? I'm trying to learn this. But a lot of brain science has illuminated that brains pay attention when we're just close, but no cigar. You know how, like, when you're learning a new chord in music or a new move in a sport, it's like really engaging, like time flies by, or maybe it's like a new move in a video game. And you're just sort of in this like time travel tunnel where nothing else exists. You're hyper focused. It feels good. That's because it's new, you're a little bit wrong. It's a little bit too hard. Not too hard impossible, but too hard where like, just one more try, just one more try. You want to do that to your brain when you study. And so ideas for that could be you photocopy your notes and then you have somebody white out some of the vocab words and then see if you can fill it in. That would be an opportunity for you to like, oh, what is that word? Okay, I know it a little bit. And maybe somebody gives you the first letter and then you're like, okay, I got it. That's being a little bit wrong where your brain's like, oh, I understand this problem. What's the answer? What's the answer? Like how you feel like if you enjoy watching Jeopardy, how you feel when you watch Jeopardy, you can do that to your brain by being a little bit wrong. So maybe you create fill in the blanks, or you take the slides that your teachers created and maybe cover up part of them and see if you can like remember to fill in the blanks. Flashcards are another example of this where you're just a little bit wrong. You have to stretch just a little bit in your memory. Your brain's going to pay more attention. Isn't that interesting? I love brains. Another idea is to pair up. So we talked about body doubling in terms of borrowing somebody's energy when you're deeply focused. Another idea is to use the socially bound parts of our brains and engage. Having someone expect you to say the answer is way more exciting and invigorating and energy boosting than having yourself just kind of go through flashcards. So why not? And teenagers, your parents love you and they miss you and they would love to do flashcards with you. And parents, your kids love you and they miss you and they would love to do flashcards with you. And it might be a tough sell at first, but it can end up being really fun. So if I'll acknowledge that sometimes parents and kids are in a wonky space right now because they've been like grinding and there's some friction about grades and there's some misunderstanding. So if that's you, no judgment, don't do flashcards together, but find your kids someone who can go through them with them, or have your kid have a study buddy over so that they can interact, because that social piece, talking, listening, and thinking is several more modalities than just being in your own head going through flashcards. All right. 3 more ideas. And by the way, at this point in the webinar, we're like just over halfway. If you're feeling like, oh, okay, Sarah has good ideas, but I'm really tired. Now is your chance to practice self-regulation. So what does your body need? Do you need to move? Do you need to stretch? Do you need to have something to fidget with? Do you need to take notes or draw while you listen? Grab some water, have a snack, whatever it is, this is your chance to practice self-regulation. Okay. A 4th idea for active studying would be to chunk for memory. So, you know how there's the like 8675309? You know why we can all remember that phone number? Because it's chunked in 2 parts and because it came with a tune. So, and if if kids are listening and they're like, what are you even talking about? It was a song a while ago where the guy just kept singing the phone number and now we all have it stuck in our brains. And that's the deal. It worked because it was repetition, it was chunked, and it was sing-songy. So why not steal what works, even by accident, and use it in our studying? So ways to chunk information to encapsulate it so it takes up one spot in your working memory rather than several is to make a mnemonic. So PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, blah, 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 the math thing. Sorry, math teachers. That is an example of taking 5 or 6 things and scooting them into one word, PEMDAS, which you can remember, and then expand it in your memory if you need to. So that's one example of a mnemonic. Or when kids were memorizing Northeast, Southwest, never eat sour worms, never eat shredded wheat, whatever it is that you learned. The idea was it took 4 things and sucked them into one spot in your working memory. The last idea with memory and sort of chunking and making things stickier in your brain is to make them a little bit strange. So maybe you have to remember a scientific process. You can think about and maybe even add some visuals to really help it stick and be like very memorable. Like, oh, well, there was a story of an old lady and she needed to buy a cat, but the cat had black fingernails, or I don't know, I'm riffing. But the idea is you weave in the details that you need to remember with something a little bit weird, and your brain will start visualizing it. You can even add visuals if you wanted to, like physically on paper, on a slide or something. And the idea is you're giving your brain something to concretize, to hold on to, that will help form structure for you to then add the pieces that you need to memorize. So those are all ideas for helping you memorize. And look at this, we're still not rereading the whole book. Ahem. A 5th idea for active studying is flashcards, which we've talked about a bit. And parents, the online flashcard programs, I know they cost money, but it's not a ton of money. If your kids use them, it's absolutely worth the money. And kids, if you're in the situation where you're like, oh, I don't have time to make a Quizlet, what am I going to do? Keep in mind, most book publishers are starting to make their own Quizlets. And a lot of people, especially if you're in like a college or a trade school course, a lot of people have already made Quizlets. So you can Google like Quizlet, name of the book, edition, and then chapter. Other people have done the work. And yes, there's definitely power in making your own flashcards. The idea of like synthesizing information, writing it physically, all of that's very reinforcing for your brain. But it is December 8th and you might have finals next week. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, let's borrow good material from somebody else. Quizlet probably has it. Okay. And the last piece is to interact. So if you own your books, write on them. If it's digital, print it out and write on it. There's a lot of power in interacting with your materials rather than like that Garfield poster I talked about earlier, where it's just the books on his head and you're hoping it sinks in. Don't do that. Don't be Garfield. Eat lasagna. Don't study by osmosis. You definitely want to interact with your stuff. So make sure that you're finding a way to stay engaged by taking notes, drawing diagrams, underlining the parts that matter to you, highlighting the pieces that maybe don't make sense so far or that the author has said a couple of times. Those types of interactions will again help make the learning stickier and get in your brain. Ooh, that's a lot, isn't it? But it's way easier than just sitting down in front of your notebook and being like, okay, now what? Because you've got a ton of tools you can try. What are you wondering about active studying? And if you think of a question a little bit later and you're like, oh, shoot, she changed slides, you know I have a back button. We can make that happen. So no pressure if you can't think of something right now. Okay. As we think about, all right, Sarah, I'm going to implement a strategy. I'm going to take one of these active studying tools and I'm going to try it out. After I've prioritized what content I'm going to study, after I've made my learning space a space that I can focus in, which might mean moving around, it might mean sound. I'm going to try one of these active studying strategies and run with it. Every time you start a new strategy, I want you to remember, pick one or two, not all of them at once, because no human can handle that. And then start thinking about how to make sure that the strategy sticks, because we know our brains and we know that the hopeful feeling that we get when we find a strategy that maybe might work feels really good. And then the next day, the next hour, the next week, when you try the strategy, you're like, where did all my fun feelings go? This is hard work. That's normal. It's dopamine of anticipation versus you trying to get like the here and now chemicals like serotonin and things like that. And those are a little bit harder to manufacture. So when we're thinking about this, let's think about, how do you keep yourself accountable? Like future you will do this strategy because you've made it unavoidable and obvious. And that means maybe right now, as you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to try Study Buddy, or I'm going to try flashcards. What will that look like? How are you going to remember to do it? Who's your study buddy going to be? When will you do it? Really make it concrete and set it up so that it is going to happen, whether you like it or not, because you've committed to it now. Another thing to think about is like, okay, I do want to try this. How can I set some reminders or notifications to make sure it happens? And the last two, reboots when it gets boring and brain stealers, we've talked a little bit about. So go us. All right, we're going to end as we usually do with a plan and a promise. So, and this is to you. You don't owe me anything. And if as you're trying your strategy, it gets a little bit bumpy or you hit spots where you're like, Sarah didn't warn me about that. Here's your warning. You have a human brain. You're going to anticipate that this is going to feel all sunshine and roses, and it's not. Because even when I create these strategies or when I borrow them from other researchers, I still hit bumps in the road because there's so many factors to real life. So with that caveat, let's think about, when will you take the information that you learned today with me and apply it? When will you gather your study materials, set yourself up for deep focus, decide what's priority in terms of content, define what enough, what good enough or mastery looks, sounds like, and empowers you to do, and then try some of the active study strategies? When? Give yourself a specific time, date, with who, make it very concrete so that your brain sees it and it doesn't stay just a knowledge thing, it actually becomes an action. Another question for you to consider is, how will you make your active studying? Which one will that look like? And then a deeper question, maybe when you do over winter break, when you're done with finals, is, okay, how am I going to make sure that these strategies, especially the ones that I try and really work, how am I going to make sure they go in my toolbox and they don't fall out of my ear come January 1st? All right, my loves. I'm going to stick around for questions. And I also want to invite you to join the newsletter. And I never ever send spam. I only send good stuff. And I have a couple super exciting announcements to send out pretty soon too. So join me at bit.ly/join team Kesty. And that will get you on our email list, and you'll be first to know about webinars and publications and all kinds of good stuff. And now I'm wondering, what questions do you have? I'm going to stop recording so that you feel a little bit safer to ask questions. If I remember how. This is the fun part where you get to watch me struggle. Dun, dun, dun.